Hello everyone. Today we start off with a new chapter, classification of the living world. What does the word classification mean? The term classification means to divide certain things into different groups, like in a school. The students are classified based on the age or based on the knowledge they possess. Like a playgroup student is not taught along with class 7 student, or a class 7 student is not taught along with class 12 student. You all have been classified into different classes based on what you know, and you're taught accordingly. Similarly, if you go to a library, you will not find all the books in one cupboard. The books have been classified based on their content. Like you'll find science books in one cupboard, you'll find history books in one cupboard, you'll find fiction stories in one cupboard, you'll find non-fiction stories in one cupboard. So, grouping of different things based on the content knowledge is known as classification. So, similarly, the living world or the living things are classified into different groups. The living organisms are first identified, then they are given scientific names, and based on their similarities and differences, they are divided into different groups. This is known as biological classification. So, the scientific way of identifying, naming, and grouping. Identifying, naming, and grouping of living organisms based on the similarities and differences is known as biological classification. Why is classification important, or what are the advantages of classification? The first point, it makes the study of living organisms systematic and simple. Like whenever we study about any living organism, if we place it into a group where it has similar characteristics, then studying about that particular organism becomes very simple. Like suppose if I want to study about human beings and I place it along with fishes, then the study becomes very complicated because fishes are completely different from human beings. So, if they are grouped along with organisms which possess the same characteristic, like suppose if I place human beings in mammals, then my study becomes simple. So, classification of living organisms is very important to make the study very systematic and simple. The next one, it helps in identifying organisms and placing them in groups. Like suppose you find a new plant, you find a new animal. Okay, now when you see the characteristics, suppose you find a flower, okay, and then it has the same characteristics like that of rose, then I'll place it into the group where roses have been placed, because now my study becomes easier. And suppose now I find an animal which has similar characteristics like that of lion, tiger, or it has the characteristic of the cat family, then I'll place that animal under cat family, because my study of that particular organism becomes very simple or easier. Next, it helps to generalize the characteristics of a group so that we do not have to memorize the characteristic as a whole. Like suppose I know the characteristics of mammals, then I don't have to memorize the characteristic of each and every organism of a mammal. Suppose I know the characteristics of birds, then I don't have to memorize the characteristic of each and every bird. So when I classify organisms into various groups based on the similarities and differences, then I just have to learn or the characteristics of that particular group and not memorize the characteristic of each and every organism. Next, it highlights the relationship between different organisms I discussed earlier. Like suppose I want to study about a lion and a cat which belongs to the same group. then I can easily study the differences and similarities between a lion and a cat because they belong to the same group. They mostly have similarities and only a few differences. And suppose I want to study about the cat family and the dog family, then I will easily study about the differences that I will find between cat and the dog family, or the similarities between the cat and dog family. Last one, it gives an idea about evolution of organisms. Like we all know, we say that human beings, we developed from apes. How do we know about it? Because of classification. Now, when organisms are classified, I told you, they are classified based on the similarities and differences. So when I start studying about the similarities and differences, when I skip then I find a link between them, we can easily find out how different organisms were formed from simpler ones into complex forms. There are two types of classification: the artificial system and the natural system. The artificial system of classification. This system of classification was introduced by Aristotle, who is also known as the father of biology. So, what does artificial system of classification mean? Artificial system of classification was totally based on superficial characters. What does superficial characters mean? Superficial characters means what we see. For example, any tall plant was a tree, any short plant was a herb, any green organism was a plant, any non green organism was an animal. So, the classification introduced, or the system of classification introduced by Aristotle, was totally based on what we see and not on their internal characteristics. The natural system of classification was introduced by Carlos Linnaeus. What does the term natural system of classification mean? Natural system of classification was based on both physical and structural characters, that means what we see, and their internal characteristics. Using this method of natural system of classification, Carlos Linnaeus introduced the two kingdom classification. He divided the living world into two kingdoms, kingdom Plantae and kingdom Animalia. Depending on their characteristics, the living organisms were either placed under kingdom Plantae or they were placed under kingdom Animalia. This was the general plan of his classification. He first divided the living world into two kingdoms, either kingdom Plantae or kingdom Animalia. Now, based on their common characteristics, the organisms of that particular kingdom were further divided into phylum. From the phylum, also picking up some organisms with very similar characteristics, he placed them into different classes. And from the classes, also, he picked out common organisms with very common characteristics and placed them under order. Similarly, into family, then genus, and then the species. So, kingdom contains many organisms with similar characteristics. Then we have different phylums. Now, phylums contains organisms with common characteristics. Okay, they will have fewer organisms than in kingdom. Then only again from the phylum, picking up organisms which with very common characters, it is placed under class. Then again picking out order, then family. So as we move down, the number of organisms decreases and their similar characteristics increases. So kingdom, there will be more organisms with less similar characteristics. As we go down, the number of organisms decreases, but the similar characteristics increases. So it's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Species, you'll find only one type of organism. Like human beings, we belong to mammals, class Mammalia. But again, in mammals we have other organisms also. So when we come down, what happens? The organisms are subdivided based on their common characteristics, and then they are divided into family. Like organisms under dog family, cat family, human beings, we are all mammals. But class is the same, but when we come to the family, then again we are subdivided based on our similar characteristics. Okay, and again from family it is picked out, and then organisms with very common characteristics are placed on the genus. And when we come down to species, we'll have only one organism. So this is known as hierarchical system of arrangement of organisms. Each group is known as taxa or taxon. The highest taxa is the kingdom, and the smallest taxa is the species. Carlos Linnaeus is also known as the father of taxonomy. Now, what does the term taxonomy mean? Taxonomy is the branch of science in which we identify, name, and classify different organisms into different groups is known as taxonomy. It's the branch of science in which we identify, give scientific names, and then we classify the organisms into various groups is known as taxonomy. And Carlos Linnaeus is known as the father of taxonomy. Why is Carlos Linnaeus known as the father of taxonomy? Carlos Linnaeus, he introduced a system of writing scientific names of living organisms. This system is known as binomial nomenclature. What is binomial nomenclature? Bi meaning two and nomenclature meaning name. So in this system, the scientific name consists of two names. The first name is known as the generic name or the genus name, and the second name is known as the specific name. Since it has two names, it is known as binomial nomenclature. For example, the scientific name of human beings is Homo sapiens. It has two names, Homo sapiens. Homo is the generic name and sapiens is the specific name. While writing the scientific name following the binomial nomenclature, we have to follow some certain rules. The first rule is while writing the generic name or the genus name, it should always begin with capital letter. So the genus name or the generic name should always begin with capital letter. The specific name or the species name should always begin with a small letter. The species name or the specific name should always begin with a small letter. Whenever a living organism is given a scientific name, it should be given in Latin. So we always use Latin language to give scientific names. Next rule, whenever we type scientific names, we should italize it, and when we write it, we should always underline it. Let's learn the scientific names of certain living organisms following binomial nomenclature. The first one is mango. The scientific name of mango is Magnifera indica. And as I've already told you the rules, the generic name or the genus name should always begin with capital letter. The species name should always begin with small letter. When you type it, you italize it, and when you write it, you underline it. So, scientific name of mango is Magnifera indica. Scientific name of lion is Panthera leo. Again, following the rule. Generic name in capital letter, specific name in small letter. Since I'm typing it, I'll italize it, and when you write it, you have to underline it. Scientific name of tiger is Panthera tigris. Panthera tigris. Now, if you see the scientific name, in the scientific name, the genus name or the generic name of both lion and tiger is Panthera, but the specific name or the species is different. Now, remember, I just explained the hierarchical order: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. That means both lion and tiger belong to the same kingdom, they belong to the same phylum, they belong to the same order, the same class, and same order, then same family, and also the same genus, because they have common characteristics or they have many similarities. But after the genus, you'll find that they will have some differences, or they have some differences. That's why the species is different. Finally, we come to the drawbacks of the two kingdom classification introduced by Carlos Linnaeus. That means the two kingdom classification introduced by Carlos Linnaeus had some demerits or drawbacks. So, what were the drawbacks? The first one, there was no distinction between eukaryotes and prokaryotes. We've already discussed what are prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are organisms which have a specific nucleus or a definite nucleus, and prokaryotes are organisms which do not have a definite nucleus. So, in this classification, both prokaryotes and eukaryotes were placed together. Like, for example, bacteria is a prokaryote, and human beings are eukaryotes. They were all placed together because there were only two kingdoms, Plantae and Animalia. So there was no difference in prokaryotes and eukaryotes. The next one, it kept photosynthetic and non-photosynthetic organisms together in plant kingdom. For example, um, we all know plants, they are photosynthetic because they contain chlorophyll and they produce their own food. Fungus, they do not contain chlorophyll, they cannot produce their own food, but they were placed under kingdom Plantae, both organisms which could prepare their own food and which could not prepare their own food were kept under the same kingdom. The next one, there are some organisms which neither fall into plant or animal kingdom. Okay, so there are some organisms which are neither plants nor animals, but still they were placed under either plants or animal kingdom because it has only two kingdoms. The next one, there are some organisms which have the characteristics of both plants and animals, but they were placed in any kingdom. Like, for example, Euglena, it has characteristics of plants because it can prepare its own food, and it has characteristic of an animal because it can move around, or it shows locomotion, but it was placed under kingdom Animalia, though it could prepare their own food. Next one, unicellular organisms like diatoms were and animals like protozoans were placed under the same were placed under different kingdoms. Now, we have done what are unicellular organisms and what are multicellular organisms. Unicellular organisms are made up of only one cell. Multicellular organisms are organisms which are made up of many cells. But since this system of classification had only two kingdoms, both unicellular and multicellular organisms were placed under the same kingdom. Okay, so these are the drawbacks of the two kingdom classification. Thank you, everyone. I hope you all understood what was discussed today. Bye bye.